Hello guys, thank you for tuning in for our second video class. This week we are going to be talking about poisonous plants. We're going to touch on close practice and touch on plants that are not to be harvested. And just a heads up, bear with me. I've got a little bit of a scratchy throat. I'm starting to kind of lose my voice, so I'm going to have something to drink here with me. I'm going to try to cut out any clips of me sipping, but if you hear me, if I miss one, that's what it is. I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. Let's go ahead and get started. So last week, whenever we did our Saturday recap check-in session, some people had agreed that it would be nice if we could recap the reading assignment. Initially, I wasn't going to do that, mainly because I wanted you all to be able to read it and decipher it on your own. But I think that with our own personal schedules and how difficult it can be sometimes to get to those reading assignments, it might be just beneficial for you if I can just recap it for you. And if you do have a chance to read it, obviously I would encourage you to do so. I won't be able to cover everything in our recap, but I'm going to touch on the highlights, the things that I really want you to take from it. So let's go ahead and get into that. So our reading assignment was all about plant care. One thing I want you to make note of is that growing your own herbs and spices can help give them more magical strength. And it infuses them with your intentions right from the start. And I do encourage you to, talk to your plants as you're growing them, talk to your seeds as you're planting them, and treat them with great respect. Our ancestors definitely believed that all plants and trees, anything that came from the earth, did have a spirit and should be treated as lovingly as we would treat a friend or family member. You definitely want to take good care of them. Talk to them, name them, get close to them. But definitely, we need to know how to care for them. If you can't care for your plants properly, they're not going to survive, and they're not going to be able to retain the magical properties that you'd like for them to. The first section talked about light. And it's really important to know how much light your plant is going to need, and it definitely does vary. If you already grow your own plants, or if you're familiar with buying seeds, things like that at the store, then you probably already know that when you purchase plants from the store, they're going to give you some sort of indication about what kind of light source this plant will need. And it's dependent on what plant it is, obviously, and it varies. They're not all the same. So there are several different levels of light. There's low light or full shade. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean no light at all. That just means less than 3 hours of light per day. And if you're doing indoor plants, they really thrive if they are low light. It's a lot easier to grow low light plants indoors than outdoors, because obviously it's easier to give shade to a plant inside. But if you're growing a low light plant inside, a good place for them to be would be in a room where it's not well lit. Maybe it's difficult to read a newspaper. Rooms with windows that face the north are a really good choice for low light plants. Then there's indirect partial shade or partial sun plants, and they need somewhere between 3 and 6 hours of light a day. And these plants do best for east-facing windows. And then finally, you have bright or full sun plants, and they require at least 6 hours of sunlight a day. But that doesn't mean that they have to have sun all day long. Just because it says bright or full sun does not mean consistent sunlight when the sun's available. So a good place to put them in your home would be somewhere where there is a lot of light. A bright southern or western facing window is great for that. And just know that if you're purchasing a plant that you're going to plant outside instead of putting in a pot inside, the light requirements are still the same. It's just that it's a lot easier to decipher outside where the light source is going to be a certain strength and where it's going to be a little bit more shaded, because you can just walk out and observe that. Obviously, when you're having potted plants in your home, it's a little bit more difficult to decipher where will be the best place to put a plant inside, since obviously there's a roof over your head, so there's not available sunlight all the time. So let's talk about watering your plants. And for me, whenever I was starting out with my own plants, this is one of the most difficult things because as a novice plant parent, I did not know exactly how much water to give my plants. And your first reaction when you see a plant drooping or wilting, you immediately think, oh, it needs water. It must need water. So I would just give as much water as I thought was necessary, and I would end up rotting the plant. So it's incredibly important to know the signs of an underwatered plant versus an overwatered plant and be able to decipher how much water your plant actually needs. And this differs depending on what type of plant it is. Like if you think of like a cactus, obviously that is not going to need a lot of water. Or like succulents, those are really, really easy to grow in a pot and don't require a whole lot of water. However, if you were to get, a plant that typically grows in a high moisture area or near water, those are definitely going to be in more need of water than other plants. So you have to pay attention to how much water your plant needs. So there's a few things that you can do to make sure that you're not giving too much or inadequate water supply for your plant. And one thing you can do is always make sure that your potted plants are very well drained. So that means look for pots before you even put your plant in the pot. Make sure the pot has holes in the bottom so that any excess water can be drained out. And typically if you go to like the Walmart or, whatever stores around you where you're going to get pots, you can find a little tray to put your pot on. Obviously, that's definitely something you want to do. You don't want to just have a plant with holes in the bottom just sitting there because then you're going to get water everywhere. So make sure you get the tray to go underneath the pot as well. And just for the record, that's coming from personal experience. Don't laugh at me. But anyway, so you make sure you get your plant a really nice pot that's got holes for drainage in the bottom and get a tray to put the pot in. And whenever you're unsure if your plant needs water or not, if you want to just take your index finger, just stick it into the top of the soil up to about your second knuckle and see if all the soil is dry. If the entirety of it feels very, very dry, there's no moisture, it's definitely time to water your plant. But if you feel moisture, it's not quite time yet, and you don't want to overwater it because it can rot the plant. Another easy way to tell if your plant needs water is to just pick it up. Just grab the pot and lift it up into the air. If it feels really heavy, chances are the soil is already full of water and doesn't need any. If it's extremely light, then it doesn't have any water in it and you might want to give it some. But definitely take a chance to sit down and get to know your plant because they are different. And even if you have followed the traditional rules for how to water and give adequate light for your plant, sometimes they do just kind of get a little finicky. They kind of have their own way because they are different. They are living creatures and they have to be treated differently from plant to plant. So just keep an eye on yours. Get to know them. Pay attention to what your plant looks like when it's happy. How do the leaves look? Are they nice and perky? Are the leaves glossy? Just pay attention to it. And you'll get to know when your plant is sad, when the leaves begin to droop. After a while of taking care of your plant, you'll figure out what it needs. When you're giving your plant a good watering, don't be afraid that you're going to over water it, meaning in one session. You have to remember that these plants are used to being outside, so they expect to be, I don't want to say drenched, but they expect a good solid rain whenever they're getting water. So the best advice I can give you is to just water your plant in one session, that is, until you see water coming out of the drainage holes. Not a lot, but when you see it start to drip at the bottom, then it has adequate water, and the plant will start to absorb the water through the soil. If you're having your plants outdoors, most of the time outdoor plants do get all the nutrients that they need from Mother Earth, but if you're noticing that any of your plants are looking a little dry, don't be afraid to give them a good water. They can follow the same test with the soil. If they're feeling really dry around them, they probably do need water. Obviously you can't lift them up, but just pay attention to their soil and see how dry the soil is. But when you're watering your plants, make sure that you're focusing your water source at the roots. Not all plants like water covering all of their leaves, especially when they're outside, because think of if you were to take a magnifying glass in the sunlight and it really pinpoints that sunlight and it can burn things and it can be really dangerous. It kind of creates the same effect when you leave droplets of water on your plant's leaves or petals. The sunlight really gets focused into that droplet and can cause damage to your plants. So if your plants are outdoors specifically, you want to make sure that you're not leaving a lot of moisture on their leaves or petals. Sometimes you're going to find that you have overwatered your plant. It's going to happen. We've all done it. You can ask anyone that's a green witch or that grows their own garden. You have overwatered your plant at one point in time. But it's okay. As long as you catch it quickly enough, you can still fix it. So specifically, if you have a plant that's in a pot, what you'll want to do is you'll want to check the roots of the plant. Don't be afraid to pull it out of the pot. Just pull it out. Check the roots. If you've overwatered them, chances are the roots are going to be kind of mushy, like brown, maybe even have a really bad smell to them. So what you're going to want to do is prune away as much as you can of those bad roots. And by pruning, I mean you want to cut them away. So you don't want to leave those mushy roots on the bottom of your plant. They're not going to survive that way. It's going to rot. So prune away as much of the bad roots as you can, leaving behind what's healthy. And once you get the roots pruned down, try to make sure that the size of your plant is kind of proportionate to what is left of the root. And just know that you can cut down pieces of your plant. If you need to trim down some of the leaves, prune some leaves off of it so that it will survive, you can do that and the plant will still make it. I would not encourage you to just go pruning off blooms if it's a flowering plant, but you can trim off some leaves, you can trim off some leaves to give the plant a better chance of survival after pruning the roots. So once you have pruned all of the bad roots away, you are going to repot the plant into a fresh pot. Or if you want to use the same one, just make sure that you've completely cleaned it out. Just get all of that soaking wet soil out of that pot. And just give it a very light watering. Don't get crazy. Just water it just a little bit. Keep in mind you're trying to let it dry a little bit. What you'll want to do is put it in some partial sun, even if it is a low light plant. Let it get a little bit of light, a little bit more light than it normally would, because you want to let it try to heal and dry out just a little bit. Sometimes it's too far gone and there's nothing you can do, and that happens. Don't be upset. I know how hard it can be, especially when you've really invested into a plant and maybe you've gotten close to it, you've named it, you've been trying to figure it out, and you intended to use it for your magic or whatever the case may be. Sometimes it can be really difficult when you lose a plant. Just know that it does happen. It happens to everyone. And, just give it a better shot next time. Just try to learn from every experience that you have. So let's say that you went on vacation or you've been really busy and you've forgotten to water your plant. So now it's underwatered and it's really thirsty. That's easy to fix too. It's actually a lot easier to fix than overwatering your plant. Basically, you just want to give it a really good watering. Just give it as much water as you can. Now, sometimes if the plant is really, really dry, you'll find that the water will go straight through the soil because the soil is just too dry to even absorb any kind of water. If that happens, take your pot, take off the tray underneath it so that the drainage holes are exposed, and you want to set the pot into a bowl or a tub of water and just let it sit there for a while and let the plant start to soak up its own water, and it will do that through the roots. The soil will start to begin to feel moist eventually as well, but just let the plant kind of sit there in a bath and it will come back around. Again, just like with overwatering, sometimes the plant is just too far gone and there's nothing you can do. It happens. It absolutely happens. Don't be too hard on yourself. Everyone has done it. It's okay. Just take it as a lesson and move forward and do better next time. So in the reading assignment, I also gave you a really good checklist of a way that you can care for your plant. And let's just go over that really quickly. So what you want to do weekly is, does my plant need to be watered? Does it look happy, and is it pest free? Do I have any yellowed, withered, or brown leaves or buds that need to be pruned away, meaning that need to be cut off? And you want to make sure that your indoor plants are not collecting dust. The leaves of your indoor plants, if they get dust on them, their pores can get clogged and the plant won't be able to absorb the correct nutrients that it needs. So you'll want to take a dry, soft cloth and just wipe the dust off if you do notice that happening. And it does happen, so you do have to keep up with that. You want to check and make sure if your plant needs repotting. Plants do have a tendency to outgrow the pot that they're in. For example, I just had an aloe plant that I had gotten it over the summer, and this plant has just flourished, and I have repotted little fragments of it so many times, and I think there's like 4 or 5 pieces of it now that have grown into its own individual plant. I'll have to take a photo of it so you all can see how big it is, but your plants will grow, so sometimes they need more space. You might have to pull them out of their pot and give them a bigger pot. A good way to know if they need a new pot is to lift up the pot and see if there are any roots coming through the drainage holes. A lot of the times, that's how you'll know for sure it's in need of a bigger pot, because those roots are coming out looking for more nutrients. And also, I really do encourage you to talk to your plants, especially when you intend to use them for magical purposes. I think that it's a good idea to tell them what their purpose is going to be, what you intend to use them for, and, give thanks to them, appreciate them for what they're going to do for your practice. And I summed up the reading with just remember that your plants are very flexible, and sometimes you have to make adjustments. You might have a plant that requires full sun that you find out doesn't really want full sun. Maybe it wants just a little bit less, or maybe it needs a little bit more than you're able to give it. Just pay attention to your plants and listen to them, and know that some of them do differ from their sister plants, and even if they're the same exact plant, it can be a learning experience for sure. Okay, so let's go ahead and start getting into our material for this video class. Let me just take a second and give a really small trigger warning. And the reason is not because anything terrible is going to be discussed, but only because some of the words that I have to use in discussing these plants may be triggering to some people. So just be aware of that as we're going through. And I apologize in advance if this is triggering for anyone. I'm not sure that it will be, but there's a chance. So I just wanted to make sure to give you all a heads up that some of the words I'll be using might kind of be triggering. They're words that if we were in the academy, I would be censoring. That'll make sense as we're going through. You'll see what I'm referring to. As I mentioned last week, poisonous plants are plants that can cause harm or be deadly to any organism that comes into contact with or ingests it. So what I want you to take away from this is, just because a plant is considered poisonous doesn't mean that it can kill you, that it would be deadly. It could just mean that there will be a negative reaction from the consumption or topical application of this plant. Some of them can even give a negative reaction when they're burned, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to get into some really specific examples, but I just wanted to make sure to be very clear that poisonous means more than just being deadly. It could just mean that it gives an adverse reaction. So why do you need to know this? Most of your magical ingredients you may not be consuming. You may not be using them topically. The thing is that you need to know proper and safe use of plants in your spell work and your magic. There are going to be times where you might read a recipe. There are going to be times where you go over a spell and everything looks totally normal to you just to read off, but I just want to make sure that you're aware that there are spells that are cycling through the internet, that are being shared on TikTok and things like that, that aren't really safe. And it's best that you know what is safe whenever you're going into this. You need to know for yourself. I don't want anyone to be working through a spell and maybe using a spell designed by someone else and come into contact with some sort of herb or spice or plant that is actually poisonous and they had no idea, because you just took someone at their word that they were telling you that something was safe. But I just don't want anyone to take any chances. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that poisonous plants and herbs and spices, they are out there. And there's a lot of different levels to it. There's a lot of different variations to it. So I want to make sure that everyone is well aware of what is safe and what isn't, or at least knows how to find out. But further than that, some of us that are green witches or hedge witches in particular, you might be foraging for your supplies, for your craft. And it is incredibly important that you in particular are able to decipher foraging for poisonous versus healthy plants. That it's incredibly important that you in particular are foraging for toxic versus non-toxic plants, that you know what you're getting yourself into, that you know which plants can be used for ingestion or topical applications versus ones that are best just left in a spell jar or just used as visual representations. Cut all of that. Oh my gosh, this is so frustrating. Okay. So hedge witches in particular, those of us that forage, you truly need to know which plants are safe to be foraged and are non-toxic for your practice. Of course, you are going to be using spell jars and things like that. Whatever it is that you might be putting your magical ingredients in, there are different uses for these plants. And poisonous plants definitely do have their place in our practice. But I want to make sure that you are aware which ones should not be ingested or used in any way that might cause you or someone else harm. Okay, so what we're going to do, I'm going to give you several slides of examples of fairly popular Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you quite a few examples of fairly popular magical ingredients that you might be using, that you might be foraging for, that are considered to be poisonous. And in every slide, I'm going to give you at least one, maybe two pictures of the plant we're going to be discussing so that you'll know exactly what it looks like. And we're just going to break them each down. It's not very important for the purposes of this class, meaning for quizzes or the midterm. I will not be necessarily asking you to tell me what the adverse reactions of ingestion of these plants will be, but I might ask you to identify these plants by photo. The reason that is because if all that you take away from these slides is that I know from the picture that this plant that I'm seeing out in nature is poisonous. That is the number one thing you need to take away. So if you don't remember why it's poisonous, you don't remember the magical properties of it, whatever the case may be, what I want to happen more than anything is for you to be able to be out in the woods, out in nature, see a particular plant and know this plant is not safe for me. I don't remember why, but I know it's not. If that's all that you remember, that's the most important thing. So, like I said, there may be some questions on your quizzes or maybe in our midterm or our final where I ask you to identify this plant. Please don't stress yourself out about it. As with everything in this class, all of this is totally optional. And if you're not one that's going to be foraging, this may not be incredibly important to you, but I do think that it could be important if you plan to forage, or if you're using ingredients that maybe should be limited, and you'll see what I'm talking about as we're going through these slides. This will be very important for you to know. Okay, so let's just get started with the first one. Most people would call this sweetgrass. It's actually called calamus. Sometimes it's used in spells for luck, healing, money, protection, peace, love, or tranquility. If you're out foraging, you might find this around watery locations, ponds, lakes. Sometimes you can find it near rivers, but definitely around water. What I want you to know is that calamus is not safe to be ingested. Traditionally, however, it has been used for medicinal purposes, and you're going to find that a lot of these poisonous plants have, throughout history, been used for medicinal purposes. If you are not a trained medical professional, you should not be using poisonous plants for medicinal purposes. Like, I cannot stress that enough. It is entirely too dangerous. It is not worth the risk. Do not do it. Just please take care of yourself and be safe. So calamus is not safe to be ingested. It can cause kidney damage, shaking, seizures, and hallucinations. However, you can use calamus for topical applications if needed. Okay, the next one is oleander, and a lot of you have probably seen this. This is a very popular garden bush. It's a flowering shrub, very pretty. I personally absolutely love the way that it looks. Its magical properties is just love, but it is very widely available. You can normally get them at any gardening supply store to plant in your own garden. They're absolutely readily available. However, ingesting large amounts of oleander can cause nausea, vomiting, excessive salivation, abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, and irregular heart rhythm. It should not be used in any spell work that requires ingestion, a topical application, or burning. Even burning oleander can be dangerous. So please do not use that for anything that isn't simply like in a spell jar or to carry around, things like that. This is not a safe plant to be using for ingestion, topical application, or burning. Okay, the next one is yew, and sometimes referred to as chinwood. Personally, I think this plant is just beautiful. I love the colors. But its magical properties are clairvoyance, compassion, consolation, divination, memory, peace of mind, protection, and rebirth. You can find yew as either a tree or a shrub. However, it should not be ingested. It can cause trembling, difficulty breathing, heart arrhythmia, and even death. It can be very toxic. So this should not be ingested. Next is wormwood. It's sometimes referred to as absinthe, old woman, green fairy. Wormwood is actually an ingredient in the alcoholic beverage absinthe, which is a little bit confusing because you'd wonder if it's poisonous, why is it an ingredient in something that is so widely used by the general public? It can cause certain effects that people would find desirable for something like that. But please keep in mind that it is very dangerous if consumed in large amounts. But also, one thing that's very important about wormwood is that it is very, very easy to confuse with mugwort. Now, mugwort is safe for human consumption. It's safe for smoking. There are some suggestions that it may not be entirely safe. There may be some adverse effects for mugwort, but it is not poisonous in the sense as wormwood is. If you were to be out foraging and came across wormwood and mistaked it for mugwort, you would be in some serious trouble. Mugwort, if you need to decipher them, mugwort is very green on one side of the leaves, whereas the reverse side of them is like a silvery color green. Wormwood, on the other hand, is silvery green on both sides, and that is almost the only distinction. If you see photos of them, you'll see how very closely they are related. Just want to let you know that before we dig into this one. Okay, so the magical properties of wormwood are clairvoyance, divination, determination, love, protection, spell breaking, and transformation. It grows pretty naturally, and you can find it on rocky slopes or at the edge of footpaths and fields. It's fairly common. If you're in the States, at least, you'll frequently come upon it. It should not be ingested in large amounts. In small amounts, it would be safe, but don't even go there. Just leave it alone. Don't even try it, because it really can be dangerous. If you don't know exactly what you're doing or exactly how much that is safe to ingest, you could easily take too much of it, and it can cause convulsions and even death if taken in large amounts. So just don't take the chance. The next one, this one is very, very common and widely associated with witches, is belladonna, more commonly called deadly nightshade or witch's berry. And the magical properties are astral projection and protection. Now, I've seen some sources that say that they might use them for love or other things, but these are the two most common properties of it. So belladonna is a branching herbaceous subshrub, and sometimes it can grow up to 7 feet tall. You can find it in shady, moist locations, especially that have limestone-rich soils. But belladonna is highly toxic, and consumption of it is almost always fatal. I strongly encourage you to completely avoid this. If you need ingredients that have astral projection properties or protection properties, there are much safer options. Although this is frequently associated with witches, please don't use it. Please steer clear of it. It is not worth the risk. Okay, the next one is iris. These are so popular and so beautiful. Absolutely love these flowers just to look at them, but they are poisonous. Their magical properties are money, faith, purification, and wisdom. You can find them mostly in drier climates or colder, rocky, mountainous areas, but they've also been found in grassy meadowlands, riverbanks. They're pretty versatile plants, and a lot of people even grow them in gardens. But if you were to be out foraging, chances are you'll mostly come across them in drier areas or meadowlands. If ingested, they can be potentially fatal. There are definitely adverse effects. So iris is best used in spell jars or carried, but do not ingest it. Okay, the next one could be surprising to a lot of people, and it's nutmeg. And yes, I know, we use nutmeg, ground nutmeg, in most of our baking recipes and things like that, but technically it is poisonous. So let's just talk about it briefly. The properties of nutmeg are luck, money, health, and fidelity. And nutmeg actually comes from a tree, which is most likely found in tropical island climates. However, in any version, whether it be raw, ground, or in oil, nutmeg in large amounts can absolutely be poisonous. It can cause convulsions, palpitations, nausea, and if you have too much of it, it can cause you to be dehydrated and give you severe body pains. Even in your cooking, you normally won't find large amounts of nutmeg being used because it can have really adverse effects. So it is safe as long as you're using it in small doses. Do not ingest large amounts of nutmeg. It's not safe. The next one is monkshood or wolf's bane. Also another really beautiful plant. Its magical property is protection. And it's not good to be ingested or to be used topically, either one. It can be very, very toxic. It can lead to diarrhea, convulsions, ventricular arrhythmia, and death. And this plant is going to be best used in your spell jars or carried, things like that as well, because you don't want to ingest it or use topically. It would not be safe. The next one is datura, or commonly referred to as devil's trumpet. Its magical properties are sleep and protection. It's a leafy herbaceous plant that grows up to about 6 feet tall, and the blooms are absolutely beautiful. They are like shaped like a trumpet, but they can vary in color. They can be white, yellow, pink, or purple. And ingestion or topical application of this plant are not advised. It can cause respiratory depression, arrhythmias, fever, delirium, hallucinations, psychosis, and even death if ingested. I would just suggest you only use this one as well in spell jars or something of the like if you're planning to use it, but definitely do not ingest it and do not use it topically. Okay, this next one is one of my favorite plants so far as appearance. Just so beautiful. It's called foxglove, but sometimes it's referred to as dead man's bells or witch's glove. It's absolutely gorgeous. I just love these colors. The magical property of this plant is protection, and you can find this as just a flowering plant, or sometimes it can be in a shrub. The best way to utilize foxglove would be to plant it around your garden, or you can bring some of the blooms inside, and they are great at protecting your area and your home, but it should not be ingested. Ingestion can cause gastrointestinal disturbances and pain, severe headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and even cardiac arrhythmias. So beautiful to look at, great to use for protection, but should not be ingested. Okay, the next one is heliotrope, and I just wanted to point out that there are actually several different versions of the heliotrope, but all around, just be very careful of this plant. Sometimes it's referred to as cherry pie. The magical properties are healing and wealth. You will very frequently find these in gardens because they are very fragrant. They smell wonderful. However, this plant should not be ingested. It can actually cause liver damage. Okay, the next one is hemlock, or beaver poison, or poison hemlock. And the magical properties are fertility, protection, renewal, and strength. It's an herbaceous flowering plant that can grow up to 5 to 8 feet tall. And this one is very, very popular, very naturally found in a lot of areas, especially wooded areas. I guarantee you that most of you are able to go out on nature walks and see the poison hemlock. One thing that is very important to note is that this plant looks very, very similar to another plant called Queen Anne's lace. If you were to see it in nature, it would be very difficult to distinguish them at a glance. However, one very quick way to distinguish whether or not it is poison hemlock or Queen Anne's lace, which is not poison, is Queen Anne's lace. The blooms, the white blooms on it, tend to be very tightly arranged with a flat surface. But hemlock, if you'll notice in the photos here on the left, it has clusters of blooms which are spaced out and kind of in an orb shape. So that's the biggest difference. And it could be a very fatal mistake to make. So make sure you're aware of that. If you're unsure, if you're out in nature and you're observing them and you see what you think might be poison hemlock, but you're not sure if it's Queen Anne's lace, just avoid it completely. It is not worth the risk. Just don't take the chance. A lot of times you might find medicinal recipes that call for hemlock, but most likely they're referring to a completely different plant that's called hemlock spruce. So just know that as well if you come across any medicinal recipes. And again, this can be fatal if it's consumed, so not to be ingested. Okay, the next one is called henbane, or devil's eye, or poison tobacco. And the magical properties of it are weather and love. It's native to more temperate climates, but it can cause dryness in mouth, confusion, locomotor and memory disturbances, and farsightedness. But if you have too much of it, you can actually experience delirium, go into a coma, respiratory paralysis, and even death. It should not be ingested and should not be burned. You can burn it if you are outdoors and in a very well ventilated area, but even the smoke and fumes that come off of this plant could be deadly. And here's one I bet you didn't know. Mistletoe. And yes, it is the mistletoe that is frequently associated with Yule or Christmas. That is actually a poisonous plant. Sometimes it's referred to as witch's broom. The magical properties are protection, love, fertility, and health. And one interesting thing about this plant is it's actually a parasitic plant, meaning that it will attach to a host tree and grow in clusters. If you'll see the photo on the far left, you'll see what I'm referring to. Mistletoe should not be ingested. It can cause blurred vision, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, cardiac problems, seizures, hypertension, and even cardiac arrest. Do not ingest it. Yes, it is very pretty to look at, and we love the significance of it, but it is not to be ingested. Okay, next is pokeweed, or American nightshade, and its magical property is courage, and it's an herbaceous plant that can grow up to 8 feet tall, and it's actually native to North America, which you don't find about a lot of plants. But if ingested, it can cause burning sensation in the mouth, salivation, gastrointestinal cramps, vomiting and bloody diarrhea, anemia, altered heart rate and respiration, convulsions, and even death from respiratory failure. It is best to just completely avoid this plant. There are safer options. Please do not use this one. And of course, there is the mandrake, or duck's foot. And of course, we're all familiar with mandrake. Thank you to Harry Potter. The magical properties of the mandrake is love, fertility, protection, money, and health. And if you were to see it in nature, it's actually a leafy lettuce type plant. It has blooms, and it's native to the areas near the Mediterranean Sea. And it's not to be ingested. If you do ingest it, it can cause you to stop breathing, birth defects, and even death. Your best outcome would be for it to cause profuse vomiting and diarrhea, but it's better to just not ingest it at all. There are other ways that you can use it in your spell work, but ingestion should not be one of them. So those are just some examples of poisonous plants. They are not by any means all of the poisonous plants. These are just some examples of them. One thing I want to encourage you to do is, if you are in doubt, if you are not sure, and I mean 100% sure that the plant that you are about to ingest is not poisonous, do not do it. It's not worth the risk. no matter the magical properties, it is not worth the risk. I promise you that you can find other plants that are very safe and that can give you the same magical qualities as something that you're unsure about. Please do not risk yourself by taking a chance on a plant that you're not familiar with. If you find a plant that you think might be really beneficial to your magic and your practice, but you aren't sure whether it's poisonous or not, take the time to at least look it up, research the plant before you use it, and make sure that you're using it in a proper way. You do not want to take a risk, guys. This is not worth it. I mean, we all love our craft and our practice, but this is not worth taking a risk over. Just make sure that you're using safe options. So, as I said, these are just some examples. Definitely, by far, not a complete list. But these are some that are pretty frequently used. So let's move on. I want to touch on closed practice plants again. I mentioned it last week in our definitions. However, I wanted to take a little bit more time just to discuss it with you. Again, these are plants that should not be used by anyone who is not part of the community and which is considered to be sacred. So we are all familiar with what closed practices are. If you are not familiar with closed practices or what they are, I would encourage you to join our Cultures Club. Check out the pins on there. There's a lot of information, and just do some research. Some very common closed practices are hoodoo, voodoo, anything involving chakras, things like that. There are closed practices out there that it would be cultural appropriation if you were to practice something that you were not part of their culture. So plants are not excluded from that. There absolutely are certain plants that different cultures hold as sacred for only their practice. Now, I'm going to tell you just straight up, I do not know all of these plants. I know a few examples of them, but I am not part of any closed practice communities, so I am not familiar with a lot of them. I would encourage you to join the Cultures Club just to be sure. I will tell you that white sage and Palo Santo are two of them that are definitely closed practice and should not be used by anyone that's not in those cultures. If you have an ingredient, an herb, a spice, a plant of any kind, a tree, in anything, if you find anything that you want to use that you are not sure about, please look it up, do your research, find out, because you don't want to be the person that didn't take the time to educate themselves over a material to find out whether or not they were using it correctly or incorrectly. Please just look it up. Find out for sure. Like I said, I personally do not know a whole lot of examples of them. I have tried to look it up to find some closed practice plants to share with you more information, but I truly just could not find any. Like I said, since I am not part of any closed practice communities, I just don't know them. But I'm sure that you have classmates that probably do. I would just encourage you to do some research if you're not sure about a plant. And also, if anyone of a certain community comes to you and says, hey, you're using this herb or this spice, and I don't know if you know, but it's actually sacred in my culture and what you're doing is offensive to me. If someone is to tell you that, I'm not saying always take them at their word, but if someone takes the time to tell you that what you're doing is offensive to them or their culture, they're probably being truthful with you. So if nothing else, that would be a good time for you to apologize and do some research on your own. Definitely find out, because you don't want to do that to anyone. That's just not right. So just when you're in doubt about it, find out. Most herbs and spices are open practice. But again, that's not to say that they all are. There are going to be some that are closed. Again, I'm sorry that I don't have more examples to give you. I wish that I did, but I've tried to do some digging and find some more examples, and I just don't have them. But if anyone knows any and you would like to share them with us, please, please, please feel free to do that in our class discussion page, because I would love to know more myself, and I'm positive that your classmates would like to know them if you're aware of any. Okay, so also let's talk about plants that are not to be harvested. One thing that I want you all to know is that there are truly over 150,000, well, it's nearing 150,000 endangered species of plants worldwide. And with that in mind, if you're foraging, please try to be aware of plants that might be endangered. And obviously that is a massive list. Although it's easy enough to find, I simply could not give you, an adequate number of examples. First of all, because we are all from different areas of the world, and there are going to be different endangered species all over the world. So, plant species, of course. So I just couldn't give you adequate examples for it to be useful for you. However, just try to get to know the area that you're in. It's worth looking to see what plants are endangered in your area if you're going to be foraging. If you're going to be planting your own plants, raising them yourself, that's kind of a horse of a different color, do with that what you will. But if you're going to go out and you're going to forage for plants that are in the woods or in nature, like, definitely be aware of what is endangered in your area, because you don't want to be harvesting plants that have a potential to be extinct. I was working on getting some focus to questions together for you, because some people had said that it would be really beneficial for them just to get them more engaged in the lessons for the week. And I was having a really hard time coming up with questions that weren't going to be like quiz material. For your focus questions, I want to get you thinking. I don't really want you to repeat things back to me that I've already talked about. I want these to be your opinion and some of your insight. So this is what I came up with for this week. Does plant care seem more difficult or simpler than you believed it to be before this week? Why or why not? I just want to hear your stance on plant care and see if you think that it's something that would be for you. Is it going to be harder or easier? So the second question I wanted to ask you is, did any examples of the poisonous plants surprise you? I know that for me in particular, nutmeg is one that surprises me because we do use it so frequently in baking. It is very surprising to know that it is considered to be poisonous just because of using it in large amounts. Of course, like I said, it is safe in small amounts, but in larger amounts it was poisonous. And I found that very surprising. So did any of them just kind of catch you off guard? Did you think that any of those plants were safe, but then learned something contrary to that today? So when you're answering these questions, if you would, just put your answers in the homework submissions channel, and I will put these questions also in the assignment section so that you'll be able to see them there too. So don't worry about writing these down. I'll post them there for you as well. And just answer those as soon as you're done with your assignment and whenever you get a chance to do it. As usual, not a requirement. This is just kind of a way to get you engaged with our lesson for the week. So let's talk about what you can expect for next week. On Monday as normal, I will post all of your weekly assignments. You can expect your quiz that day as well. And then on Wednesday, we'll do our video class. I'm struggling to get these posted on time, and I really appreciate your all's patience with me. I really don't want to give excuses for just not being on time, but I just have a lot going on personally, so it's not always easy for me to get them posted on time. But I hope that in doing the video class as opposed to like a voice class, it's easier for you all because you can reference it again instead of having to be there at a certain time. It's definitely easier for me as well with everything that's going on personally. But so I apologize for not being able to get these out exactly on time every week. But my goal is to get it posted on Wednesday. Okay, and then on Saturday, we will do our recap session. This recap is actually going to be with Hannah this week, our class aide. And I'm not sure if she's going to do that as a voice class or if she's just going to do it textually, but I'll let her decide. Whichever way she wants to do that, it's totally up to her. So she'll be doing your recap this Saturday, and that'll be a time for just checking in, seeing how you guys are doing. If you have any suggestions or things that you would like to kind of alter a little bit, you can also ask questions as we did this past week. Some of the questions, if they're more geared towards me, if you have questions that you might need to ask me instead of the aide, feel free to contact me anytime. I'm always available for you. I may not get back to you immediately, but I will get back to you. I promise. I won't ignore anyone. So you can either send me an email or you can message me on the Academy. Either way, if you have a question specifically for me. But Hannah is extremely knowledgeable, so she'll be really helpful for you all. So we're really lucky to have her. So with that said, our class is complete for the day. I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your week and a great weekend. And I will get your next assignments posted on Monday. Thanks, guys.